Hilchos Pesulei Hamukdashin Perek Shmini, the laws of disqualified sacrifices, chapter 8. We continue today to discuss the laws of disqualified bird sacrifices. And we're in for a fun ride for the next couple of days, I gotta be honest. It's not a scare tactic, just telling you the truth. Today, tomorrow, and the next day, the coming 3 chapters of the Rambam are very complex. They're based on 3 chapters of Mishnah that are also very complex. They make up a tractate, the smallest tractate in all of the Talmud, called Masechet Kinim, the tractate dealing with pairs of birds, all about confusions in bird sacrifices. The Mishnahs are extremely cryptic, extremely shorthand and hard to decipher. There's a wealth of commentaries, multiple different approaches to almost literally each and every line in those Mishnahs. And for whatever reason, the Rambam, although he's usually the clear codifier, makes everything concise and easy to understand, it seems like he chose to continue that path of being cryptic in the chapters which he codified from those chapters of Mishnah, which is today, tomorrow, and the next day. In the Rambam also, there's a wealth of commentaries, many different approaches as to how to understand many of the lines in the Rambam. As we do in this class, I always choose one approach that I think is the most systematic, the most easy. I relied personally heavily in preparing these chapters on the Rambam HaMevur. That's a commentary to the Rambam that was published very recently by Rabbi. He did a tremendous, wonderful job distilling Rambam to a very simple and straightforward meaning. Of course, if you happen to know, or anybody watching online, if you happen to know a different commentary or a different approach to any of the halachas as I'm going to present it, please leave it in the comments, get me the feedback in whatever way you can. I'd love to hear it. But as I'm going to present it, it's going to be in this one direction, one approach that we're going to choose. And you know what, Rambam, we come back to again and again. If you do 3 chapters, it's every year. If you do 1 chapter, it's every 3 years. This time we'll choose this approach. Perhaps next time we'll be able to dive into a different approach. I'll be honest also, I spend a lot more time preparing the material than I usually do because it's very difficult content, so the pictures are not going to be the greatest. It'll be pretty lame actually, but I'll just suffice to do what I can to describe the basic halachas. And with that, let's get right into it. The basic assumptions that you have to know going into this chapter are the fact that bird sacrifices were typically brought in pairs. Pair in Hebrew is called a ken, or kinim in the plural, although ken many times for modern Hebrew means nest, but here in this context it means a pair of birds. Ken is a pair of birds, kinim, pairs of birds. There are 2 ways to bring bird sacrifices. Either as a voluntary donation, you want to donate a pair of birds to the temple. In that case, both birds in the pair would be brought as an oila, as a burnt offering. But we're going to get to that variation only in chapter 10. For today and tomorrow, it's important to talk about the obligatory bird offerings. This is the other scenario where you would bring a bird offering if you were obligated to do so by the Torah. A woman who gave birth is one classic example. Ideally, she's supposed to bring 1 animal and 1 bird, but if she's poor, she would bring a pair of birds. A person who experienced an abnormal discharge for a man, or an abnormal blood flow for a woman, a zav or a zava, when they became pure, they had to bring a pair of birds. A person who had saras, a lesion, when he recovers, if he couldn't afford the animal sacrifices, he would bring a pair of birds. There are many scenarios where a person had to bring, for obligatory reasons, a pair of birds. Now, when you bring a pair of birds, in the end of the day, one of them will be brought as a chatas, one of them will be brought as an oila. One is going to be a sin offering, one is going to be a bird offering. When exactly you designate each bird could vary, as we're going to learn later today. Either when the owner buys the birds, he's supposed to differentiate them and say this one will be for a chatas, this one will be for an oila. If he doesn't do so, when you bring it to the Cohen and the Cohen performs the rites, so the procedures on the sacrifices, he will say, this one is going to be for a chatas, this one is going to be for an oila. Of course, it's very important to know which is a chatas and which is an oila, because as we've been learning yesterday and earlier than that in the other sets of laws about sacrifices, there are fundamental differences to how you go about offering a bird, burnt offering or sin offering. A chatas of a bird is performed on the bottom half of the mizbeach, whereas an oila is performed at the top half of the mizbeach. That's going to be the big one. There are other differences as to how exactly you sever the head or don't sever the head, how you squeeze or sprinkle the blood, but the main thing is that the chatas are done at the bottom half of the mizbeach, while the oilas are done at the top half of the mizbeach, so you always have to know which is the chatas and which is the oila. And of course, if they get mixed up now, you're in big trouble, because you can't just say, hey, I'll do whatever I want. Each one requires a specific method of offering. And that's going to be the subject of today and tomorrow and also the next day. What happens when we have different variations of mixtures between chatas birds, oila birds, and also non-designated birds? Because as I just said, if a person wants to bring a pair of birds, he can wait till the Cohen designates them, and that whole time, they're undesignated. You don't know which is going to be the chatas, which will be oila. All you know is that one of them is going to be a chatas, or one of them is going to be an oila. It actually even seems, as the commentaries point out, that people would wait for pairs of birds to accumulate before bringing them as sacrifices. In other words, if you were obligated today in one pair of birds, you might wait 3 weeks, and you know you're going to have another pair of birds to bring then, and you'll bring 4 birds to the temple at once, and you might end up with a group of 4 birds which are all undesignated. You know 2 of them are going to be a chatas, 2 of them are going to be an oila, but you don't know in the meantime which one that is. And again, it becomes super important to know, because what if they get mixed up? What do you do with the birds? Which ones need to be done at the bottom? Which one's done at the top of the mizbeach? How do you offer it as a chatas? How do you offer it as an oila? And we're going to be dealing with different scenarios of mistakes and mix-ups as they come along. So the Rambam begins with a general principle. He says, Halacha Aleph, chatas ha'oif shenis arva ba'oila sa'oif. If you have a bird meant to be offered as a sin offering that gets mixed up with a bird that's meant to be offered as a burnt offering, or it's the opposite. This bird is meant to be a burnt offering, it gets mixed in with a bird that's meant to be a sin offering. And even if it's not one-on-one, afilu achas biribuy, even if it's 1 to 10,000, kulan yamusu, they all need to die. Because every single one you may be bringing in the wrong way. How are you going to choose which bird to bring on the bottom of the mizbeach and which bird to bring on the top of the mizbeach? If you're going to choose to bring it on the bottom, maybe it's the oila that got mixed in. If you're going to bring it on the top, well, maybe it's the chatas. How could you actively do a sacrifice in an improper way? And so therefore, unfortunately, every single bird in the mixture needs to be thrown out, needs to be left to die. But that's only if you know that it's a chatas or an oila. By Medvarim Amurim says that Rambam, when do we say this? When they were designated at the time that the owner bought the birds. Zu chatas v'zu oila, this one for a sin offering and this one for a burnt offering, as I said before. You can designate it either when the owner buys them or at the Cohen's time of performance. So this law is said when the owner already designated them. So you already know this is a chatas, this is an oila. Now if they get mixed into the other type, they all have to die. But if a person simply brought a bunch of birds for his obligation, mehen chatas umehen oila, some of them are going to end up being a sin offering. Some of them are going to end up being a burnt offering. V'loi peiresh, but he didn't designate them. Elo kulan stumais. They're all undesignated. If then a designated sin offering bird or a designated burnt offering bird got mixed into this stuma, this is a very important word we're going to keep on having, non-designated obligatory pairs of birds, yesh lahen dinin acherim, they have other laws, more complex laws, more detailed laws. So long as it's straightforward, chatas and oila, boom, kill them all. But if you have, let's say as in the first scenario we're going to consider, you have a chatas that gets mixed into a bunch of undesignated birds. So yes, you know, in the end of the day, if nothing would have happened, out of these birds, 2 of them would have ended up being a chatas, 2 of them would have ended up being an oila. But right now you don't know which one's which. And therefore there are different laws. And the Rambam begins with this scenario. The Ketzad Dineyan. What exactly are those laws? Im nisarva chatas b'chayva zu hastuma. Let's presume that it was a chatas bird that got mixed into this undefined, non-designated, obligatory birds. And we're going to choose an example where it was one chatas bird that got mixed into 4 non-designated birds. Okay, let's just call it, for example, there was a guy who needed to bring 2 pairs of birds for whatever reason. Let's say he was a zav and he also had saras. And he went over to the bird store, picked up 4 birds. He says, you know what? These are going to be for my obligation. He didn't say chatas, oila. They're all sitting there. And now into this pile of birds flies a chatas bird from someone else who knew he had a pair of birds and he knew this one was a chatas. And the chatas flies into the pile of birds, and now watch what we have. Boom, 5 birds, and we don't know which one is which. One of these is for sure a chatas. The others, 2 of them are going to be a chatas, 2 of them are going to be an oila. And now, as the commentaries explain the next line in the Rambam, this is referring to a scenario where the Cohen went to ask a rabbi what to do. These 5 birds came before him, and he's being told, one of them is a chatas, the other 4 are non-designated. So he goes to the rabbi, there was a court sitting in the temple, and he asks them, what should I do? Ideally, in other words, in the first instance, lechatchila, what we call, what do I do? So the court will tell him, ein kosher ella minyan chatoyis shebechayva bilvat. It's only kosher for you to sacrifice the number of birds in the non-designated group that would have ultimately been brought as sin offerings. That's a very complicated way of saying you can only offer 2 birds as a chatas. In other words, let's explain this a little bit. Let's say we knew this was the chatas bird, and these are the 4 birds. So we can put aside the chatas bird. How many of these 4 would have ended up being a chatas? 2. The other 2 would have ended up being an oila. Therefore, now that there's a chatas mixed in, and we don't know which one they are, so definitely we're not going to take any bird and offer it like an oila on the top of the mizbeach. Because we might be, once the Cohen does that, he might be grabbing the chatas bird that was actually designated as a chatas, that got mixed in, and offering it improperly. So definitely nothing is going to be going on the top half of the mizbeach. But here's what you could do. You could grab 2 birds and offer them on the bottom of the mizbeach as a chatas. Because what are the possible scenarios? Either you grabbed the bird that was actually a chatas and offered it as a chatas, along with one of the undesignated birds, and by offering it on the bottom, you're making it a chatas, which is fine. Now you've offered 2 chatases. Or you aren't touching the actual original chatas that got mixed in at all. You're just picking out 2 birds from the original 4 that were non-designated, in which case that's fantastic. You're bringing 2 as a chatas. So that's all you can do. All you can do in this scenario, where it's a 1 chatas mixed into 4 non-designated birds, is to take the number of birds that would have potentially been offered as a chatas and offer them as a chatas. But that's it. Aval minyan ha'oilas shebechayva. But the number of birds that would have been ultimately brought as oila birds, which is 2. Im hachatas shenisarva behen. And the additional bird, which was the original actual chatas that got mixed in, psulim. Those are disqualified. Those may no longer be sacrificed. Why? As the commentaries explain. Once you're going to grab the 2 birds, like the rabbis tell you, and offer them as a chatas, what automatically happens to the other 2 birds that were originally non-designated is that they actually assume the status of an oila. So long as there was 4 mixed in, you never know which is chatas, which is an oila. Once you take 2 and you say these are going to be chatas, automatically the other 2 become an oila. Now what do you have? Of those 3 birds remaining, you now have 2 oilas and 1 chatas. Shaharei nisarva chatas ba'oiles. We now have a classic scenario, what was described in the first halacha, of a chatas bird that got mixed in 2 oila birds, in which case they all need to die. And so again, as an initial preference, as an initial instruction, all the Cohen can do is take 2 of them and offer them as a chatas and leave the other 3 to die. Halacha gimel lefichach. Therefore, since the guiding principle of this type of mixture is that you take a look at how many non-designated birds there are, and you see how many of them would potentially be offered as a chatas, and that's how many from the entire mixture you can offer as a chatas. Therefore, says the Rambam, we can restate this law in an easier way. That's how we're going to present this halacha. That the Rambam is basically saying exactly what he just said in different words. And the reason why he chooses the coming words is probably to communicate another law that I'll talk about in a second. But really what he's about to say now is just a repeat of what he just said. Therefore, says the Rambam, Im hoysa hachayva shtayim bechatas. If the total number of non-designated birds was double the amount of those birds that were supposed to be brought as a chatas eventually, it's a complicated way of saying, if there was an even number of birds that were non-designated, such that half of them were going to be a chatas and the other half would be an oila, so that the total number of non-designated birds is double the number of potential chatases that are inside it, then when the chatas, the actual designated chatas, gets into the mixture, chatzi achayva kosher v'chatzi apostle. In the end of the day, half of the amount of undesignated birds is going to be kosher, while the other half is going to be apostle, right? Because what did we just say? What do you do in this scenario when a chatas gets mixed in? How many of these birds are going to end up being sacrificed? Only 2. So ultimately, out of the 4, you could say technically, how many were offered? 2. Again, a repeat of the last halacha, in other words. Why is the Rambam saying it this way? Because by saying it this way, he's communicating another law. What would have happened if by the time the chatas got mixed in, it wasn't that ratio? It wasn't the ratio of chayva shtayim bechatas. It wasn't a ratio of the total amount of non-designated birds double the amount of chatases. Rather, it was less or more. Meaning, for example, as the commentaries say, what would have happened if before the chatas flew in, the Cohen would have already offered one of them as an oila? He has 4 undesignated birds, He knows in his head, I have to bring 2 as a chatas, 2 as an oila. So he begins the process. He takes 1 and he offers it as an oila. And that's when Mr. Chatas bird flies into the mixture. By the time the Chatas bird flew into the mixture, how many were originally left as non-designated? 1 oila and 2 chatases. That's not chayva shtayim b'chatas. That's not the total amount, double the amount of chatases. That's actually half the amount of chatases. Or if you include them, it's a ratio of 3 to 2, essentially. In this scenario, you couldn't use that line, chatzia chayva kosher v'chatzia pasul. You wouldn't be able to say half is kosher, half is disqualified, because actually 2/3 are going to end up being kosher. Because you're going to apply the rule in halacha beis of ein kosher ela minyan chatoyes shebachayva. You look at how many would be offered as a chatas, and that's how many are kosher. Same thing in the opposite scenario. Same thing if before the chatas bird flew in, the Cohen had taken one of these 4 and actually offered it as a chatas. And then the chatas bird flew in. This is also not a case of chayva shtayim b'chatas, because how many birds are left that are undesignated? Only 3, of which only 1 is going to be a chatas. So actually it's a ratio of 3 to 1. The total amount of birds is 3 times the amount of how many chatas birds there are left in the mixture. So you wouldn't again be able to say that easy way of remembering it, half kosher, half disqualified. Instead, in this scenario, once the chatas bird flies in, only 1 more. The minyan chatoyes shebachayva, only that 1 bird in the undesignated mixture that was going to be brought as a chatas eventually remains kosher. So again, really, it's just the same thing being said in other words. If you begin before the mixture with an even number of birds, in which half of them are going to be offered as a chatas, so once the chatas bird flies in, it'll create a scenario where half of the amount of undesignated birds will be kosher and half will not be. If not, you won't be able to go half and half. You'll have to do the math in your own head and figure out how many birds are supposed to be brought as a chatas, and that's the amount of birds you'll pull out and actually bring as a chatas. That's how the Merkeves HaMishnah explains this piece of Rambam. Now the Rambam adds, V'yiroi li, it seems to me, that even though in the Talmud, even though in the Mishnah, what do you do with this mixture we just described? A chatas flies into 4 birds. You only end up bringing 2 birds. Only the amount of birds that were going to be potentially chatases. Says the Rambam, it seems to me, and as the commentaries explain, this is where the Cohen is not consulting with the rabbis. If the Cohen wants to go on his own and take action, he can do something that will make an additional bird kosher. Shehu oise kulan lematon, or lemata, kemase chatas. He can take all 5 birds and offer them all on the bottom of the mizbeach, just like you would do to a regular chatas. And what you gain by this is that you've now kosherized the original chatas bird that flew in. Because if you do them all at the bottom half of the mizbeach, so 2 of them, anyways, from the non-designated mixture, were going to become chatases. The 3rd one we'll call the original chatas bird that flew into the mixture. And yes, the other 2 were supposed to be brought as an oila, but you brought them at the bottom, so they became disqualified. But if you do them all at the bottom, you gain that extra bird. If you follow what it says on halacha beis, when you come to the rabbis and ask them, they're going to tell you only do 2, maximum. You can only take 2 and bring them as chatases. You can't take more than 2. But if the Cohen takes action and brings them all at the bottom, retroactively, 3 will become kosher. Now, of course, this causes a big problem, as the Ravid asks, because you're going to be bringing purposely 2 birds that are meant to be an oila on the bottom half of the mizbeach. How could you do that? How could you take a bird that's meant to be offered on top and offer it on bottom? So the Kesef Mishnah answers that there's an important caveat here, which is that you never designated any of the birds as an oila. They were all non-designated. And since they were all non-designated, they're a little bit more lenient. Now you should be jumping in your seats, because I told you before, as part of explaining halacha beis, that it doesn't matter if you designated it or not. The moment you take 2 and offer them as a chatas, the other 2 become de facto designated as an oila. So who cares if you designated them or not verbally? Once you took 2 to make them to a chatas, the other 2 became an oila for sure. You can't take an oila and offer it on the bottom of the mizbeach. So the Mikdash David, one of the big authors on Kaddashim, he discusses the laws of sacrifices. He explains that it's true. It's true. If the Cohen would take the birds and announce that he's making them as a karban chatas, and the moment he finishes dealing with 2 of them, the other 2 would become an oila, and you couldn't do that. Look at the Rambam's precise wording. The Rambam says, Oise kulan kemase chatas. he should simply perform the chatas procedure with them. He shouldn't say anything. Just do the chatas procedure. By doing the chatas procedure, only at the time of doing will those specific birds become chatases. And therefore there will be no time where the oila will be standing on its own and becoming an oila bird. And therefore, you'll be able to get away with the Rambam's new approach and kosherize a third bird out of this mixture. Halacha Daled is a repeat of Halacha Beis and Gimel in the opposite scenario, where it's not a chatas that flies into the mixture, it's an oila that flies into the mixture. And the exact same principles are going to apply in the reverse. Halacha Daled v'chein im nis'arva oila b'chayva zu astuma. The same thing we just said applies also if it's not a chatas but an oila that gets mixed into a group of non-designated birds. And again, we're choosing for argument's sake 4 birds, just to make it simple. There's 4 non-designated birds, 2 of which are supposed to become a chatas, 2 are supposed to become an oila, and an oila, an actual designated oila bird, flies into this mixture. And again, we're going to go with the approach that now the Cohen is asking the rabbis what to do. What should I do? I have 5 birds, 1 of which is for sure an oila, and the 4 of which are 2 potential chatas, 2 potential oila. What do I do? The rabbis will tell him, Ein kosher ela minyan oila shebechayva. All you can do, the only thing that's kosher for you to sacrifice is to take 2 of these birds and offer them as an oila. Offer them on the top. Because what's the maximum that could happen? Either you're going to be actually grabbing the bird that was originally supposed to be an oila and offering it on top, which is great, together with another one from the non-designated birds, which you're now making an oila by offering it as an oila. Fantastic. Or you won't be touching the actual oila at all. You'll just be taking 2 that were originally in the non-designated pair, bringing them as an oila, which is also great because 2 were supposed to be an oila. You can't take any more than that, because the second you take another one, then you may be touching one of the birds that's meant to be a chatas and offering it on top. Or if you try offering it on bottom, you may be taking the bird that was originally an oila and trying to offer it on bottom. So we can't allow you to offer more than 2 birds. The number of birds that are supposed to be chatases in the undesignated pair of birds. Together with the bird that was actually an oila and got mixed into them, Pesulei, they're disqualified, you cannot offer them. Shaharei, because the moment you take 2 of those birds and bring them as an oila, as the rabbis instructed, the other 2 in the non-designated pair assume the status of being a chatas, and now you have nis'arva oila b'chatas. You have a mixture of an oila and a chatas, which the Rambam said in Halacha Aleph, causes them all to die. And here the Rambam adds something that he really could have added in the last scenario of the chatas, as the commentaries explain. He's just copying the Mishnah, and there's a reason why the Mishnah does only by the oila, but he adds a point. These laws apply whether the total amount of non-designated birds was greater than the amount of oilas that got mixed in, as in the case that I chose, 1 oila to 4 non-designated. But it could also be true that if there's a bunch of oilas that got mixed into just 2 non-designated birds, you always have the same law. So they were equal. It's 4 to 4. Always, when the Cohen comes to the rabbis to ask for instructions, they're going to say, Ein kosher ela minyan oila shebechayva. Maximum you can take is the amount of non-designated birds that were supposed to become an oila. Any more you take, you may be touching a chatas if you offer it on top. And if you offer it on bottom, you may be touching an oila, which cannot be done. Lefichach, says the Rambam, therefore, since I've just stated to you this law, we can restate it with the same principle that we used in Halacha Gimel. If initially the amount of non-designated birds that there were before the oila flew into the mixture was a ratio of double, in which the total amount of birds was double the amount of birds within that mixture that were going to be offered as oilais, once the oila bird flies in, when the rabbis instruct you to take the number of oilais out of that mixture, you're going to end up taking half of the original non-designated pile. Half will be kosher, half will be disqualified. Whereas on the other hand, as we explained before, if before the oila came inside, the Cohen would have offered one of the birds as an oila, or one of the birds as a chatas, the point being that by the time the oila bird, the actual oila bird, flew into the mixture, there wasn't a ratio of double. The chayva was not shtayim ba'oilis. It was either a ratio of 3 to 2, or 3 to 1, not exactly double. Then you wouldn't be able to say half-half. you'd have to revert to the principle in the beginning of the halacha, ein kosher ela minyan eilas shebechayva, that the amount of kosher birds that the Cohen can sacrifice is only the amount that would potentially be eilas in that non-designated mixture. And here too, the Rambam adds his own addition, v'yirah li, it seems to me, that even though if the Cohen were to ask the rabbis what to do, they would say only take the amount of birds that will potentially be an eilah. The truth is, shehu oisa kulan l'mayla k'masar eilah. The Cohen could take action himself and offer them all on the top, like an eilah is offered, thereby kosherizing a third bird, the bird that was potentially the original eilah which got mixed in. You'll take all 5, offer them on top of the altar, and thereby in total 3 birds will be kosher. All you'll have is 2 birds that are disqualified, those 2 which were supposed to become the chatases, and as I explained before, from the Rabbi, the Kesef Mishnah, the Mikdash David, altogether we got a beautiful explanation in the halacha, at the pshat is that you'll just do them kimasei eilah. You do them in the procedure of an eilah, which will make them automatically all in the same category. There will be no time at which 2 of the birds will have become into a status of chatas, and thereby there'll be no problem to initially bring them on the top, not at the bottom, because they never became a chatas. And this way what you gain is, you gain 1 more kosher bird. If that all sounded confusing, it's because it is. Again, we're doing our best here to clarify it to the extent possible, but we're going to leave it at that and go on to the next halacha. Halacha hey, choiva stuma v'choiva acheres stuma shenisarvu. 1 pair of non-designated birds that got mixed into another pair of non-designated birds. You have 2 pairs of birds. This one eventually is going to be offered 1 chatas, 1 eilah. This one will also eventually be offered 1 chatas, 1 eilah. And they got mixed. And it doesn't matter the scenarios. How do you have 2 pairs of birds? The Rambam says, Bein shahayu shtein mishem echad, whether they're both being brought for one reason. Kine zavim im kine zavim. It's 2 pairs of birds that both belong to a zav, a man who had an abnormal discharge became pure now. Ay mishnei shemas, or if they came about as a result of 2 different reasons. Kine zavim im kine yildas. It's 1 pair of bird is being brought for a man who had an abnormal discharge. The other pair is being brought for a woman who gave birth. Doesn't make a difference. Bein shahayu shteyem la'adam echad, bein shahayu lishnayim. Whether both pairs of birds belonged to 1 person or they belonged to 2 different people. 2 different people will be more classic, but even 1 person, he could have had 2 reasons to bring a pair of birds. And that's how his birds got mixed up. Commentaries actually get into it. If it's 1 person's birds, do they have to be 2 different reasons or 1 reason? In other words, do they have to be, let's say, 1 for a zav and 1 for tzaras, or they could be both for tzaras? Kesef Mishnah says that on a simple level, they have to have come about because of 2 different reasons, because if the person is bringing 2 pairs of birds for the same reason, that's not 2 pairs of birds getting mixed up. They're all undesignated together. And then if they got mixed up, all you do is just take 2 and offer them on top, 2 and offer them on bottom, because anyways 2 are supposed to become a chatas and 2 are supposed to become an eilah. But others argue, and they say that it's even possible for a person to have a confusion with 2 pairs of birds that are being brought for the same reason. And that's because only if he would buy them all together do they become 1 big non-designated pair. But if he separates them separately, puts 2 birds here and 2 birds there, by putting the 2 birds aside in 1 group, he's already created 1 entity of chatas and eilah versus another entity of chatas and eilah. So now when those 2 pairs of birds mix, they become the ta'aruvas, the mixture being discussed in this halacha. But the bottom line is, you have 2 pairs of birds of which you don't know which is a chatas and which is an eilah, and now they become mixed. Says the Rambam, Im hayu shtein shavos. We're going to begin with a case where both non-designated pairs of birds are of equal size, as in this case, 2 and 2. So in the end of the day, mechza kosher or mechza pasul. When the Cohen offers them, half will be kosher and half will be disqualified. It doesn't matter what the Cohen's going to do. Bein she'asa hakoil l'mayla, oy hakoil l'mata, whether the Cohen ends up performing the rites of all 4 birds on top of the mizbeach or at the bottom half of the mizbeach, oy asa chetzion l'maylan v'chetzion l'matan, or he did half on top and half on bottom. L'oilam mechza kosher or mechza pasul. Always half will be kosher, half will be disqualified. Why is that? The Rambam goes into a little detail here. Because you think about it, you have 4 birds here, all mixed up. In the end of the day, 2 of them are supposed to be an oila, 2 are supposed to be a chatas. And we know, sin offerings are performed on bottom, burnt offerings on top. So if you put all 4 birds on top, so of course, 2 are kosher, They're the ones that were supposed to be burnt offerings to begin with. Other two, supposed to be sin offerings being offered on top, problem. If he performed them all on the bottom, then the half are kosher, the ones that are supposed to be a chatas, but the other half are disqualified because they're supposed to be an oila, but on top, he brings them on bottom. Also, the chetzion lemaila, even if the Cohen takes two of the birds and performs them on top, two of the birds and performs them on bottom, he's still in a bit of a quandary. And consider these cases, as the Rush explains it here. He says, best case scenario, you took one bird from each pair, and those are the ones that you offered on top, and you took one bird from each pair, and those are the ones that you offered on bottom. In that case, they'd all be kosher. But since both pairs got mixed up, even if you did two on top, two on bottom, but what if you ended up taking both of these ones and putting them on top, and both of those ones and putting them on bottom? Now you've created a problem. Because within each pair, one of them needs to be a chatas, one of them needs to be an oila. You can't get away with putting both on top. And so considering that possibility, half of each pair will be non-kosher. Let's read it again inside. Asa chetzion lamata v'chetzion lamaila. If you perform, the Cohen performs half of them on bottom, half of them on top. Chatzi hachetzi shenasa lamaila. Half of the half that's going to be done on top, kosher mipnei ataruvis v'hu oilis, is kosher because of the mixture on account of it having at least one oila in there. V'chatzi hachetzi shalmata kosher v'hu chatois, and half of the ones performed on the bottom is also going to be kosher, and it's a chatas. But the other half, yeah, if it was from the other pair, good. But if not, it might be from the same pair, and now you've brought one pair both on bottom, which is a problem. Maybe we can make this a little bit more illustrated, okay? My son is 3 months old. Just got him a pair of rubber duckies for the bath. So we have a lot of rubber duckies, okay? We're going to use these 4 rubber duckies to be our props. Not sure if you can see very well, but these 2 are more of a brighter orange than these 2. So if you're looking, you can cheat and you can know which pairs are which. But let's just say there's 2 guys. He has 2 pairs. He has a pair of birds. He has a pair of birds. One of these birds needs to end up on bottom, and one of these birds needs to end up on top. One of these birds needs to end up on bottom, one of these birds needs to end up on top. Now that they all got mixed up, so of course if you bring them all on top, 2 are kosher, 2 disqualified. If you bring them all on bottom, 2 and 2 are also kosher and disqualified. What if the Cohen takes 1 and 1 and puts them on the bottom, 1 and 1 puts them on the top? So your instinct is to say, great, anyway from the entire mixture, 2 are going to become chatas, 2 are going to become oila, so why aren't they kosher now? The answer is, because in order for them to be kosher, the Cohen needs to have been lucky enough to take 1 bird from each pair. That was the one that the guy needed to be a chatas on the bottom, oila on the top. But what if the Cohen ends up taking these 2 orange guys and bringing them on the bottom? Well, now you have 1 pair from 1 guy, you brought both birds on bottom, and the other pair, the other guy brought both birds on top. So only one of these is kosher, one of these is pasul. That's what the Rambam is saying, that when you have 2 equal pairs of birds, non-designated, getting mixed up, in the end of the day, whatever choice you make, half are going to be kosher, half are going to be disqualified. And by the way, I should note from the Mekeres HaMishnah that this entire halacha is only after the fact. If the Cohen offered the birds, half is kosher, half is disqualified. If the Cohen comes to the rabbis and asks them what to do, they're going to tell him to begin with, not to offer all 4 birds. They're going to say, take half the birds, put 1 on top and 1 on bottom, because anyways, that's what's going to be kosher, so why bring, to begin with, 2 birds that are going to become disqualified? Just take half and bring them in the proper way. Halacha vav, that's all if the 2 pairs of birds that got mixed up were of equal amounts. But what if they were of unequal amounts? Halacha vav, hayushtei achayves hastumei shenisarvu zug dela mizu. The 2 pairs of birds, non-designated, that got mixed into each other, one was bigger than the other. One is 4 birds and one is 6. So now there's a bit more to consider here. And we have to remember that since these 4 began as one entity, and these 6 began as another entity, out of these 4, 2 have to end up on the bottom of the Mizbeach and 2 have to end up on top, and out of these 6, 3 have to end up on bottom and 3 have to end up on top. Now they're all mixed together, but if we can separate them conceptually, we have to make sure that half and half is chatas oila, half and half is chatas oila. Therefore, as the commentaries explain, if the Cohen would come to the rabbis and ask them what to do in this case, they would say to him, do not offer more than 4 birds. Out of this mixture, you can only take 4 birds and offer them. Because 4 birds is the amount of the smaller pair, in which case if you'll divide 4 birds, put 2 on top and 2 on bottom, you'll be bringing 2 as a chatas, 2 as an oila, and you can say, those are the smaller pair of birds, and they're being offered as they should. The second you're going to offer more than 4 birds, let's say you take 5 birds. What are you going to do? 2 on top, 3 on bottom? You know what may have just happened? What may have just happened is that those 3 that you offered on bottom all came from the smaller pair of birds, of which only 2 could be offered on bottom in the maximum eventuality. And you just disqualified one of the birds from the smaller group. Same if you would take 5 birds and offer them 3 on top and 2 on bottom. You know what may have just happened? You may have just grabbed 3 birds from the smaller pair of 4 and offered them all on top. More than the maximum amount. From that pair of 4, only 2 could be offered on top. You offered 3. Therefore, the rabbis would say, don't get into that. You would only be able to take 4 birds from this mixture and offer them, the rest are disqualified. But what if you didn't ask? The Cohen offered all 10 birds. So then, im asa hakoil l'mayla, or asa hakoil l'mata, we asked the Cohen what he did. If he offered all 10 birds on top, or all 10 birds on bottom, mechza pasul mechza kosher umitam shabiarnu. So half will be disqualified, and half will be kosher for the reason we explained. If you offered all 10 birds on bottom, so half of them anyways are going to all be offered on bottom as chatases. So yes, the other 5 are disqualified. Fine. Or if you brought them all on top, same thing. Maximum, you brought 5 oilers properly, and the other 5 that were supposed to be chatases got disqualified. However, asa chetzion lemata, the chetzion lemaila, if the Cohen would have offered half of them on top and half of them on bottom, so yes, there could be a lucky strike in which he selected exactly 1 from each pair, put them on the top, 1 from each pair, and put them on the bottom, but very possibly that's not what happened. Imagine if, for example, the 5 that he chose to put on the bottom were all of these 4 and 1 from this pair. What happens now? Of these 4, 2 were supposed to be on top. You just disqualified some birds. In this scenario also, all 5 of these ended up going on the top, of which 2 were supposed to be on the bottom. 2 more, besides the one you put on the bottom. You've caused a big problem. So we have to ask the Cohen what exactly happened. Im achar sheshoal osakain. If he did this 5 and 5 split after asking the rabbis what to do. And as I mentioned before, if the Cohen would ask the rabbis what to do, what would they say? You can only offer a maximum of 4 birds. Because that's the way you make them all kosher. So since the rabbis gave the instruction to make 4 birds kosher, the Cohen doesn't have the power to undo that kosherization of the rabbis. And therefore we say hamuat kosher. The amount that was in the smaller pair is going to be kosher. And we'll say that the ones that were offered in the proper way belonged to the ones in the smaller pair. However, if the Cohen took this step completely on his own accord, he didn't even consult with the rabbis, then hamerube kosher. Actually, the bigger pair, or the amount equal to the amount of birds that was in the bigger pair, is going to be kosher. Because, what do you have here? As the Rambam explains in the following halacha, Zeh haklal, this is the guiding principle. Kol she'asa hakohen midaito chetzion l'mayla v'chetzion l'mata. When a Cohen performs on his own accord, half of a group of birds on top and half of a group of birds on bottom, v'i efsher shelo yiyeh mishel echad l'mayla u'lemata, and it's impossible that at least one of the pairs had 1 done on top and 1 done on bottom, harei zeh hamerube kosher, so that bigger pair is kosher. When you do 5 and 5, whichever way the 5 and 5 split them, whatever way you slice them, in this scenario, 1 of the birds of the bigger pair was brought on top, and 1 of the birds was brought on bottom. That's for sure. Because if, let's say, these 5 were the ones that he selected for the top, this remaining 1 ended up on the bottom. If these 5 are the ones that remained on the bottom, then at least 1 of them went on the top. So of this bigger pair, 1 of the birds for sure went properly on top, 1 of the birds for sure went properly on the bottom. And because of that, we have a principle that's called toilin. Once we know for sure one thing is kosher, we can drag along everything else in that group. And then we'll say that the entire bigger group is kosher. We'll say that the Cohen lucked out and he made sure that those 6 birds were brought on top and on bottom. Hayil v'davar yadua, shemiktzas karbanesav l'maylo, miktasav l'mata, since for sure part of this guy's sacrifices ended up on top and part of it ended up on bottom, you call karbanesav kshedim. All of his sacrifices will be kosher. Whereas if the Cohen had done so after receiving the direct instruction to only kosherize 4 birds, that's the maximum birds that are going to be considered to be kosher. Now, as the Rambam is simply understood, when he says hamuat kosher, hamerubah kosher, he actually means that the owner of the smaller or bigger pair of birds fulfilled their obligation. The Rabbi argues, the Rabbi says no, the kosher may just mean kosher to be sacrificed, but doesn't count for the owners. The Rabbi also has a whole different opinion. He thinks that always the merubah is kosher. Always the bigger pair will be kosher. He agrees that if the Cohen will come to ask, the rabbis will tell him only to do kosherize 4 birds, but if he did it after the fact, always the merubah is kosher. But the Rambam says, even after the fact, if the Cohen had first consulted, the smaller amount is kosher. If the Cohen didn't consult at all, the bigger amount is kosher. Halacha ches, shnayim shalakchu kinei be'eruv, 2 people had bought their pairs of birds together. Or they gave the money of the worth of their pairs of birds that they're supposed to bring to the Cohen. In other words, they didn't play any part in designating their birds as either chatas or oila. Le'ezer sheyirtza kohen yakriv chatas, or le'ezer sheyirtza yakriv oila. So the Cohen, it's his disposition. He can do whatever he wants. He'll have in mind to bring a chatas and oila for this one, chatas and oila for that one. He gets to choose the birds. She'ein akinin misparshin. Here the Rambam says the rule I mentioned in the beginning of the chapter. Pairs of birds only become explicit or designated only when the owner the owner buys them, or when the Cohen performs them, as we explained. Halacha tes, hayu lifnei hakohen chatois ve'oiles. Cohen is sitting in the temple. He's here for work. He has in front of him birds that are definitely chatases and birds that are definitely oiles. We'll just call it 2 and 2 for purposes of simplicity. Asa shtein l'mayla, or shtein l'mata. If he does them all, he performs them both. In other words, both groups, the chatas groups and the oila groups, he performs them all on top by mistake, or all on bottom by mistake. Mechza kosher or mechza pasul, so half is kosher, half is disqualified, because obviously 2 were oilas and 2 were chatases. So if they're all done on bottom, the 2 chatases are kosher. All done on top, the 2 oilas are kosher. Also chetzen l'mayla v'chetzen l'mata. But if he performed half of them on bottom, half of them on top, but he didn't know which one was which. He didn't know did I do the chatases on bottom or the oilas on bottom. I have to be stringent. I have to assume it's all disqualified. Because I could say it was the burnt offerings that he performed on bottom and the sin offerings on top, backwards to the way that it's supposed to be. Now, by the way, the Kesef Mishnah notes here that this whole halacha is only said if initially the 2 chatas birds and the 2 oila birds hadn't gotten mixed up. It was simply an honest mistake on the part of the Cohen. Because had they gotten mixed up before the Cohen did anything with them, well, that was halacha number 1. If a chatas mixes with an oila, they all have to die. But there is a commentary, the Mishnah's Chachamim, that writes that no, this halacha could also apply even if they had gotten mixed up before. Because yes, it's true they're supposed to die, but what if the Cohen didn't know that, or he didn't listen to that? He actually ended up offering them. We have to know, are they kosher or disqualified? So the Rambam is ruling over here that if they were done fully on top or fully on bottom, half are kosher, half are disqualified. If they're done half and half, and then they're also all disqualified. Halacha Yud, hayu lefanav shleisha tziburei oifes. What if the Cohen has in front of him not 2 but 3 piles of birds? As the commentators explain, these piles came about in the following way. 2 people came with a bunch of birds to the Cohen. The Cohen starts dealing with one person and starts designating his chatas and oila birds. And he creates 2 piles. Echad chatois ve'echad oiles. One is a chatas and one is of definite oilas. Then the other guy puts forth his birds, but the Cohen didn't designate them yet. That one remained undesignated. Half is supposed to be burnt offerings, half is supposed to be sin offerings, and he didn't yet designate them. And now at this point, as the commentators explain, the Cohen forgets whose birds are whose. Whose birds did he already designate as chatas and oila, and whose are undesignated. Says the Rambam, im asa kulan l'maylo oilamata. If by mistake he takes them all and he performs them all on top or all on bottom, mechza kosher or mechza pasul. So half of the total will be kosher, half of the total will be disqualified. Because you have in this entire mixture here. You have half definite chatas, half definite oila, and of this indefinite, half is chatas, half is oila. So if you put them all on top or all on bottom, the half that are supposed to be oila or chatas are all kosher. Also, chetzel l'mayla v'chetzel l'mata. If you put the half of the total amount of birds on top and half of total amount on bottom, and as the commentators explain, the case is where you don't know what you did with the chatases and the oilas definite ones, but you do know that the indefinite ones were divided half and half. That you know. So you forgot if you put the chatas on top or on bottom, the oila on top or on bottom, but this one was definitely split half on top and half on bottom. So then, ein hakosher elo hasasum bilvad she'asa chetzi l'mayla v'chetzi l'mata. All we can consider kosher is the undesignated pair or pairs of which half was done on top and half was done on bottom. Even though it's owned by one person, as I explained before, after the fact, we're going to split it between the two people and say, hey, you got 2 birds or you got 2, or whatever the scenario was. Because as I said before, the Cohen forgot whose is whose. Whose were the indefinite ones and whose were the definite ones. The 2 pairs, the 2 piles which he had already designated clearly, Pesulei are for sure disqualified. Because he doesn't know which one was done on top, which one was done on bottom. It's very possible that the oilas ended up being offered on bottom and the chatas ended up being offered on top. And therefore these 2 are out of the picture. These 4 which are unclear, since you divided it half and half, they're for sure kosher, because half was on top, half was on bottom. But since you don't know who it belongs to, you divide it equally between the 2 people.